If the person that you're striking up a friendship with knows more about your relationship and what's going on than your spouse does, then you're heading down that path.
Yeah.
You're listening to Healing Broken Trust podcast with Brad and Morgan Robinson, where we talk about healing from affairs, infidelity, trust, and cheating in your relationship from the perspective of a professional marriage therapist and affair recovery expert. If you want to save your relationship after infidelity, this podcast is for you. Welcome to episode 21, where we're talking about the 10 different types of affairs. We're asking the question, are all affairs created equal? This is a really important question because not every situation is going to look exactly the same. It will help you to know and recognize the different types of affairs that are out there so you can know how to handle your unique situation better. And if you haven't already done so, go to healingbrokentrust.com/episode 21. That's the number 21, and download the resources that go along with this episode. Also, if you haven't yet seen the information on our one-on-one retreats and you'd like more personalized help, check out the retreats page at healingbrokentrust.com/retreat today, and let's get started.
Especially group private practices where the entire practice is devoted to working with couples or just one area of specialization.
Yeah.
And that's what we do. We specialize in relationship therapy. The average therapist out there might see 3 or 4 couples a week, but we see 50 couples every week coming through our office on average. Every therapist who works with us is committed to researching the best methods for working with couples. And research has shown that the more common method for working with couples was only about 35% successful, and only 17% of the couples actually maintained their improvement after 2 years. And that's research.
Yeah, and that's a huge relapse, really.
Definitely. One of the methods that we use, emotionally focused couples therapy, has also been researched, and it was discovered that 86% of couples make significant improvement in counseling, and that's the couple saying that they've made significant improvement, right?
Yeah, not the therapist saying, hey, they got better. It's the couple saying they made significant improvement, not just improvement.
Exactly. And then they followed those couples and they found, 3 years after counseling, 90% of those couples actually kept their progress, which is a big deal. I mean, people usually want to know, is this going to help us? Are we going to get back to where we were again? Yeah. And so that's a big difference.
Yeah, that is. It's
and
huge. It's a huge difference.
We help relationships really at any place, whether you're wanting to stop your divorce, wanting to remarry after divorce, or maybe you're just wanting to prepare for marriage, or you're just having, trouble connecting with each other. So we really help relationships really at any place.
Yeah.
Today we're talking about the different types of affairs, and there are 10 different types of affairs that we've identified, right, Brad?
Yeah, there's at least 10 different types, and these are just categories just to understand. If you've gone through an affair, if you're in one of these categories, your affair is in one of these, it may not be a complete description of it. Yeah. So it may be, like we're going to talk about there being a one-night stand, and then we're going to talk about somebody who's a burned-out spouse. Maybe there's a combination of these different categories at times. Yeah. So not every affair nicely fits into these categories, but we put them into categories to help us understand them.
Yeah, and that's really important.
So there's 10 different types. I'll just briefly list off the names of these 10 different types. So there is the one-night stand. There is the limerent affair. There is the sex addicts affair. There is the shared interest affair, the emotional affair. There's the idealized love affair. And there's the philanderer's affair, the sexual abuse affair, and I'll explain that. Let me just, because that's going to throw people off. That's basically when someone's abused, taken advantage of, and their spouse thinks that they were having an affair, but they were actually raped or they were sexually abused. And that obviously is very complicated because the one who was abused is their spouse thinks they cheated on them, and they were actually taken advantage of. And that's and then there's the revenge affair, and that's when someone's been betrayed, they want to get even with their spouse and they get them back. And then the exit affair. Okay. There's the one-night stand. And the one-night stand, this very well may be a one-time betrayal. It can be more than one time. And it can happen more than one time without that person being a sex addict. And so there's a fine line between a few one-night stands and being a sex addict. To really be diagnosed as a sex addict, you don't want to self-diagnose. You want to meet with a therapist that specializes in that, which is something that we can do at Marriage Solutions. You don't want to self-diagnose yourself with something like that. You can have more than one-night stands, but commonly one-night stands occur when a spouse is away from home, usually on business or a pleasure trip, something like that, and they happen in the heat of the moment. They give in to temptation, and that usually happens when there's drinking, and they can be anonymous. So they're traveling, business, pleasure, by themselves. There's drinking. They give into temptation.
Poor boundaries.
Poor boundaries, things like that. Now, when this kind of affair happens, it's not necessarily an indication of problems in the marriage or that the betrayer is dissatisfied with her spouse. In fact, one of the distinguishing points in this type of affair is the betrayer wants to stay in their marriage. So sometimes we get people who have an affair, and one of the common elements is they're burned out. The marriage really has issues, but they really want to be a part of the marriage. This is someone who can be happily married and still does this because alcohol is involved. They're away from home. Maybe they're curious. Some temptation involved.
You want to talk about the characteristics?
Yeah. The core of this betrayal is really bad choices, bad boundaries, the lack of integrity, mixed with the opportunity to act. Typically, there's no emotional involvement, and it happens typically with a perfect stranger who's befriended in the situation. And we've worked with plenty of people with this, and this can be very hard to understand and make sense of. Why did this happen? As we talked about before, getting to why and understanding why, it makes it more bearable. Not knowing why just makes this much harder.
But we've been able to help people recover their relationship even after this.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So this type of affair, the one-night stand, may be motivated out of loneliness or curiosity, which generally result of poor boundaries and misguided thinking that this could never happen to me. I'm going to get close to the edge of the line, but I'm not going to cross it. Normally, individuals who have had one-night stands tell themselves that they will go to the grave with this secret. I'm not telling anybody this. This is not an indication that they want out of the marriage. In fact, they fear that if they tell this secret, they're going to lose the marriage, and that's really the wrong approach with that.
And that's something that we've talked about in the past, being completely open and forthright and honest, because that really is what begins the healing process for the relationship.
Yeah.
This hiding doesn't help.
But the one-night stand, basically, they don't want to disclose it, because then the whole marriage is going to be shattered.
Yeah.
So characteristics of this type of affair, it's really an affair of convenience or opportunity. It's not something that's really sought out, but rather it occurs as the opportunity is presented. The betrayer does not want to leave the marriage. That's another characteristic. And then it's not really an ongoing relationship. It may happen a couple times. A relationship can develop from this. And one of the ironic things with this is when people are betrayed, especially when it's a one-night stand, they say, gosh, this would be so much easier if you had a relationship with this person. I can understand it better.
Right.
And then when people have been betrayed by their spouse having a long-term relationship, they're like, gosh, you just had a one-night stand.
And everybody thinks the grass is greener on the other side.
Yeah, exactly. They think the grass is greener. And here's the important thing. If you're listening to this and you've been the one who had the affair, it's just as hard, even if it was a one-time mistake or a year-long mistake. It's still just as hard. There's different elements that maybe make it harder. As far as pain goes, either one's about a 10.
About painful, yeah.
Yeah, and then...
Are these typically sexual relationships? Because we've talked about, emotional affairs. We talked about...
Yeah, they're typically sexual, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's pretty...
Alcohol's involved. Yeah, it's typically just pure sex, that kind of thing. Let's go on to the limerent affair.
Okay, so the limerent affair, this type of affair is really characterized by two individuals who believe they are in love. And with this type, betrayers believe that they have fallen in love. It's the love addiction affair that we've talked about. And they feel powerless over powerful emotions. It's not uncommon for them to feel guilty about what they're doing, but at the same time, they feel like they are no longer in love with their spouse, and they know that they will never be happy unless they're with their lover. So it's this guilt complex we talked about, right? Where they want to go home to their spouse and they want to be there with their spouse because they feel guilty, but the whole time they're really thinking about this love object that we've described it as in the past.
Morgan, you hit the nail on the head. They feel guilty about having the affair, but also they're miserable at home. So they go home to their spouse because they feel bad about having the affair. But then when they're home, they crave being with the affair partner because of that limerence.
Yeah.
And we talked about limerence before.
Right.
But they crave that limerence, and so then they'll go back
to the
affair partner.
Yeah.
And so they bounce back and forth. And it can really stretch out over a period of time.
Gotcha. Yeah. And usually it develops from an existing friendship that begins really where the boundaries have been breached. And so basically those boundaries, they weaken and then they finally give in. And I think it's really interesting, something we've talked about in the past, that sometimes people in a limerent affair, they really, really try to quit it. They really try to go back to their spouse, and then they go back to work or where that person may be, and all of a sudden they see them in the hallway and it's like a light switch switches, and they're like, oh my gosh, and they fall into this limerent affair
again. Back to it again.
And it's like an addiction, a love addiction.
Yeah, Morgan, what you were saying is important. This kind of affair starts as a friendship first. It begins as the boundaries between the two individuals weaken. This type of affair is not like the one-night stand. It's not based on sex necessarily.
The ideal of that person.
Yeah, well, it's the feeling of being in love.
Oh, yes.
In fact, the power driving the relationship, it's really the strong emotions generated by the growing growing romance. And it's, this limerence, we've talked about this before, I'll just remind our audience. Limerence is a fancy term to describe a few basic feelings of love. Love sickness, infatuation, obsessive love, love addiction. It's this romantic love. Yeah. And so when people are having a limerent affair, they're feeling this romantic love feeling, and it really starts a growing romance, and that's why they want to leave their spouse and be with this person.
The betrayer believes he or she wants out of the marriage, right? So they think they want out of the marriage. The betrayer believes he or she is in love with the affair partner and is willing to sacrifice life with their spouse, right, for the opportunity to be with the affair partner. And typically, this type of affair is a long-term relationship versus the one-night stand, where it's very temporary and very one-night standish.
Yeah, it's a long-term relationship that develops into a romance.
And then frequently, there's a pattern of betrayers swinging back and forth between their marriage and their affair partner. And when they are at home, like we talked about, trying to do what's right, they're miserable and they feel like, they'll never be happy. And when they're with their affair partner, they have this euphoria, this ecstatic euphoria, but they may be feeling so guilty that they can't stand it. So they move back home only to feel miserable and to realize once again that they can never be happy unless they go back to the affair partner. So it's this back and forth dance. And then this dance of insanity, quote unquote, can continue for years. So this back and forth can happen for a very long time versus the one-night stand, maybe short. Betrayers often seem incapable of making a decision about what they're going to do, and they don't want to be, in the marriage. Other factors may keep them from choosing to divorce. For example, feelings of guilt or failure may cause them to stay. There may also be strong feelings regarding, what's best for the kids. So they may decide to stay for the children, but a lack of commitment to the marriage is a real problem. So
choosing to leave isn't the solution. But this kind of affair too, Morgan, I want to include this. In this type of affair, with limerent affairs, the betrayers have most likely already made the decision to leave their marriage. When people are experiencing limerence, they've kind of made up the mind, I think I'm done. I don't think I want to be here anymore. And so we'll see them come to counseling, usually out of respect or something like that.
But at that point, most of the time, they've decided that they're done. They just want to care for their spouse. And
they just want to end on good terms. And so that's usually why they come to counseling.
But we've been able to help people break out of the limerent affair and actually rekindle their relationship with their spouse.
Yeah, definitely. And so they want to leave. They've already made the decision to leave. They believe they can't be happy unless they get to be with the one they love. Unlike the one-night stand, this kind of affair indicates a deeper problem in the marriage. The marital problem is not the cause of the affair necessarily, but there are defects in every marriage, and sometimes those defects definitely play a role in an affair. And so, at the very least, they can serve as inhibitors to the betrayer wanting to work on a marriage. Well, you've got these flaws, you've got these things, why do I want to stay with you? And part of that is limerence at play. And part of that's just the reality of that's what marriage is like. Everybody has issues.
Right. And we talk about, you put two flawed human beings who are not perfect, right? And you put them together and you think, oh, it's a perfect union, but there's no such thing. You've got two flawed human beings. You're going to have a relationship with flaws. So it's natural.
And let me say this, Morgan, because one of the things I know people listening to us talking about this, and if they're in this, they may think, well, holy crap. This is hopeless. They want to leave. They're in love. They no longer love me. They feel like our marriage has issues. They went out of the marriage. They've been bouncing back and forth for a long time. It's not hopeless. One of the key things of overcoming a limerent affair is really the person experiencing limerence knowing that it's limerence. Just them knowing, okay, I'm experiencing limerence. And here's the characteristics. These are the factors that go into that. And we've got a show on that we've already done. But just knowing that, many times that causes people just to put on the brakes.
Yeah, and to understand what's going on.
Yeah, because they think they're in love. They think they found their soulmate.
Right.
And many times they're grateful to know that, hey, this is what they're experiencing.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the key things. And the other key thing is when you do this, and we haven't discussed this yet, but you have to start doing last resort techniques. You have to start doing things as a spouse when they've decided they want to leave.
And that's something that you've really developed a lot. The last resort technique, when your spouse is trying to leave you, when they're done, there are ways to actually save your relationship.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly go over that. And we're going to do this in a future show. Basically, there's 4 things that you want to do, and these are one-sided. But when you're trying to get someone back, they're leaving for very specific reasons. And so we're going to discuss those in a different show. We're not going to get into those today, but there's things that need to be done. And so it's not hopeless, at the very least.
Yeah, definitely. It's not hopeless. We can definitely, help. There are ways to rekindle the relationship. About the different types of affairs. There's 10 different types, but we are on the third.
Yep.
The sex addicts affair.
The sex addicts affair. These affairs are committed by individuals, and this could be male or female, who have an ongoing pattern of sexual betrayal. such as frequenting topless bars or adult bookstores, viewing pornography, compulsive masturbation, prostitution, repetitive encounters with sexual partners, and other behaviors that are destructive to both the individual and to the marital relationship.
So this is kind of that stereotypical one that everyone thinks, oh, if they've made the mistake of having an affair, that they all kind of are lumped into this category. But it's not entirely true that everybody is
it's not.
a sex addict.
Not everybody who has a one-night stand is a sex addict or goes to topless bars. Everybody that goes to topless bars is not a sex addict. But here's the important thing with this. If you have, I would say, a majority of these things that we just listed, a pattern of sexual betrayal like topless bars, adult bookstores, viewing pornography, compulsive masturbation, prostitution, repetitive encounters with sexual partners, those can be evidence of a sex addict. And let me say this. I know we talked about one-night stand a few minutes ago. When a sex addict has a one-night stand, this is someone who seeks out the opportunity for sex. And so I had a guy one time I worked with. He would pick up women from bus stops in his car, and he would have sex with them. And he did this 17 times. So he had 17 one-night stands.
Oh, my gosh. That he could remember.
That he could remember at this point. And, the guy is a sex addict. Now, those are a little bit more than one-night stands. And so if you've traveled for business and you've had one-night stands, you may not be necessarily a sex addict. You probably have very bad boundaries. But it is worth exploring so that you can get the right treatment for it. Because one of the things in rebuilding your marriage back is the behavior has to stop. Right. Trust has to be rebuilt. And each time that a one-night stand reoccurs, you're demolishing any sort of progress that's been rebuilt.
And these people that are seeking out these sexual relationship, there's not even really a relationship, sexual experiences, sometimes they feel like they just can't find the fulfillment in their marriage.
Yeah.
It's a deep void.
Well, even though they're married, they haven't found complete fulfillment from the marriage. In fact, they're enslaved by desire to satisfy their longings. They're driven by obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. They're powerless over their extramarital attachments to these behaviors, to people or objects like pornography. They're really powerless to this. These individuals look to extramarital attachments to meet the need for love and acceptance instead of allowing their mate to fulfill these needs. And so this is really important. What they have is they have a huge amount of toxic shame. They feel really unacceptable as a person. They feel unlovable. They feel shame is what gets them into sex addiction. And these individuals are looking for sex to meet the need for love and acceptance that they have. And unfortunately, it just creates more, and I'm going to get into this in a minute, but that shame that comes from being a sex addict just creates, in fact, more of a compulsive need for sex addiction.
This category is not about the marriage as much as it is about the addiction. Is that correct?
Yeah. Sex addicts don't typically have affairs because there's issues with the marriage. Now, they may blame the marriage when they get caught. Well, you did this to me one time, or that happened, or this happened. And so really that's my excuse for seeing topless bars and pornography and having a string of 17 women. They can use that as an excuse, but not that the marriage doesn't have issues, but that's them trying to save face.
Right.
Most likely, they would have pursued these same behaviors whether they were married or not, or if they were married to Miss America. They still would have pursued these kinds of things.
Right.
And so this is key. The shame and fear associated with this type of behavior perpetuates the dual life of an addict, propelling the destructive behaviors. It just creates more of this. And so they often feel hopeless, they feel trapped by these behaviors, and they're afraid to come clean because they don't want to lose their marriage or give up their addictive behavior. And so this type of betrayal, it's especially difficult for the spouse who's been betrayed because their suffering is not just from the betrayal, it's from their inability to understand their mate's behavior. What the addict has done seems so foreign, the spouse cannot comprehend it. So finding out why is really important in this.
That why is so important. Yeah.
And one of the things a sex addict could do is even have sex with someone of the same gender when they're not a homosexual. They could still have a sex with someone of the same gender, and that really makes it hard. And so figuring out why, what makes it hard to recover is not knowing the why.
Yeah, because they really have a deep void that needs to be filled.
It's the shame that they have.
And the guilt.
There's so much shame there. I'm such a bad person. And they're trying to remove that toxic shame. I'm such a bad person that they're looking for sex and acceptance.
It's almost like sometimes self-abuse. Sometimes pursuing something that will...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm just going to go through these characteristics real quick. One of the things that can happen with this is when the betrayed spouse, they're in such a shock because it is outside the norms of healthy sexuality, obviously. And so they're so shocked about this at the magnitude of the compulsive behavior, that makes it also difficult for a couple to recover.
Yeah.
But the characteristics of this is it's a habitual pattern of extreme behaviors that are either sexually related or they're relational. So that means somebody can have a series of flings that are emotional affairs, like through text messaging or emails or things like that, and not quite reach sex, but they may have phone sex or something like that. Typically, the betrayer wants to save the marriage, but they still have a compelling drive to look elsewhere to meet their needs. Mm-hmm. They want to save the marriage, but they still have this compelling need to be a sex addict and act out sexually. Often these behaviors began before the marriage, and this is really important. They stopped after they got married, and then they began again after the addict realized that being married couldn't meet the needs that they have the same way as acting out does.
The addictive behaviors.
Yeah. And so that's really important. So they may stop for a little bit and then kind of go back to it after getting married. It is common for the betrayer to have made past efforts to stop the behavior and to have actually been successful for a season, only to relapse after believing things were better. They kind of feel like,
let their guard down.
Yeah, they feel like, well, I can stand over the edge of this cliff and look down. And this is important, and this is a huge part of why this sex addiction continues, is the betrayer has a deep sense of shame and guilt. And the behavior creates more shame and guilt, and they have tons of shame that leads them into this kind of lifestyle.
Negative cycle.
Yeah, just reinforces it. The sex addict needs to be in individual counseling for their addiction. Being remorseful will not cure a sex addict. You need to go to a therapist who specializes in this. Recovering from an affair is not possible until the betrayer gets the help they need for their addiction. I say this because unless they get the help they need, it will happen again and again until this is dealt with directly.
And what's really important is you can't self-diagnose. You really need to go to someone. You can't just say, oh, my spouse is a sex addict, but you're not the therapist. So go to a qualified person before you just make the assumption that they're, an addict.
Yeah, but, you need because a sex addiction diagnosis is a heavy diagnosis, and you need to make sure that it's a legitimate diagnosis.
Right.
Something that, you have to fill out. And,
that's legitimate.
In Oklahoma, 1 out of 6 couples will do marriage counseling with a professional before divorce, which is really low.
That is low.
That's pretty bad. But I talked about the limerent affair, and we're going to talk about the second type of the limerent affair. This first type is more the classical type of limerent affair, where a person feels like they're madly in love with someone and they want to leave the marriage because they want to be with that person as their soulmate. What may happen is they may leave the marriage to be with that person and then come back. They may leave home to be with that person, and then when they're away, they feel guilty, so they'll come back home, and it's just a dance of insanity that happens.
And then while they're at home, they feel the longing to be with their other
the other person, and that puts you through the grinder when you go through that. Then there's a sex addict's affair,
and there's a small percentage of people that actually have a sex addiction affair.
It's actually, there's a very few number, but when they do, it's very clear because it's a lot of people.
A lot of people that they've had an affair with is what you're saying.
The shared interest affair, that's what we're going to talk about today. The emotional affair and the idealized love affair, which is the second type of limerent affair. We're going to talk about philanderers, men and women who are philanderers, who think it's pretty much normal or morally okay to have sex. They cross the line and they don't think they're cheating, or they think it's okay to cheat.
Sex outside of marriage, right?
Yeah, it could be sex, it could be anything. It could be kissing, other types of sex other than intercourse. Then there's a sexual abuse affair, where someone's sexually abused and their spouse mistakes that for an affair. The revenge affair, this is when someone's been betrayed and they don't have their spouse to help them try to heal, and they want to make them feel the same pain they have. So the revenge affair, and then the exit affair. And so the shared interest affair, and let me say this before we get into this. Every affair, these are put into categories. Some of this is information that I've created. Some of this is information from Rick Reynolds. He's a therapist down in Austin. And some of this is from Dave Carter, who's also, and all three of us work with infidelity. And there's pretty much about 10 different types of affairs. And there could be more than that, but just for the sake of classification, they're put into 10 different types of affairs. So not every affair may clearly fit into one category that we're discussing in this series of types of affairs. So may not fit perfectly. There may be more than one category that your affair sits into. And so it's
good to know.
It's very important to know that. So the shared interest affair, in this situation, the betrayer, they'll be involved with a single person, and at the same time, they don't want to leave the marriage. To the person having the affair, they look at their affair partner as a soulmate. And these affairs frequently spring from a relationship in which the two individuals share something in common, such as music, art, or another interest. It could be movies, it could be technology, it could be just something that they don't have in common with their spouse. And so they turn to the affair partner for understanding, companionship, and support. It is as if the betrayer develops two lives. They share one part of themselves with their mate, and then they reserve another aspect of life for their affair partner. And pretty much every affair has, I would say, most affairs have some element of this, where they kind of have a duality You kind of have a secret fantasy life, but this is a little bit more developed in this type of affair. So let me repeat that last thought. It's, the betrayer will develop two lives. They share one part of themselves with their mate, and then they reserve another aspect of life for their affair partner. Daily activities and information are divided into two realms, that which will be shared with their spouse and that which will be shared with the affair partner. Usually this type of affair indicates that there are other deficits in the marriage.
There's just a lack of closeness somehow.
There could be a lack of closeness. There could be closeness. It could be lack of time together, that kind of thing. Let me be clear here. Marital problems is no excuse for infidelity.
Right.
Just because you have issues doesn't mean it's okay to go cheat.
Right.
And those are areas that need to be addressed in order to strengthen the marriage. So some of the common characteristics of this type of affair is the individuals want to stay married who have the affair. It's unusual for the affair partner to be referred to as a soulmate. It can happen. And there may be a little bit of limerence in this type of affair as well. The betrayer's life is divided into two parts, the part shared with their spouse and the part they share with the affair partner. So, two different distinct needs are being met by these two different relationships. An important part of figuring out why in this kind of affair is asking, how are you different?
Interesting, yeah.
Because why is an affair? Because you're different in this type of relationship. You like how you feel in that. So asking how you're different would help understand a little bit more of the motivation of why someone had that affair and what they were drawn to.
Yeah.
And so, Morgan, the next part is the emotional affair.
This fifth type of affair is commonly referred to as an emotional affair. This is the fifth on our list. Although some would not consider an emotional entanglement an affair because it hasn't been consummated, and a lot of people don't see it.
If you're not having sex, it's not an affair.
Which, that's what they might think, but truly,
that's what betrayers many times think.
This type of relationship can be just as devastating and destructive as a sexual affair. Emotional affairs are not commonly discussed, and frequently their lack of sexual involvement, like we said, is used as a rationalization as to why it's not an affair. But technicalities in no way absolve the reality of the situation. So, usually when a person has to put the word just in front of the word friend, there's a problem. The notion that a lack of sexual involvement somehow prevents this type of relational intimacy from being an affair, it really is baffling. Anytime someone other than our mate is permitted to enter the most intimate areas of our life, we're just giving something that we have no right to give. And we have already given and committed our heart to another, to our spouse. And so sharing intimate details of your life with someone else other than your spouse, that's an affair. One good way to identify this type of affair is if your mate's best friend,
quote unquote best friend,
quote unquote, yes, has more information or insights about your mate's life than you do. Does this quote unquote friend know more about your marriage than you do? If your mate is closer to a friend than to you, it is already an affair, and it may seem harmless because they've yet to cross the sexual physical line, but it is an affair nonetheless, and a lot of times these do lead to the physical affair. So the characteristics really are boundary issues. That's a factor. The betrayer is better friends with that individual than his or her spouse. The betrayer keeps secrets with his friend instead of with his or her spouse. The betrayer does not want to choose between the friend and the spouse, and the betrayer wants to stay married, usually. This one seems more sneaky to me. It seems a lot more sneaky. It kind of sneaks in.
People honestly have a hard time knowing if it's an affair. The one who's been betrayed, they say, yes, it's an affair. The one who was involved in it, many times they don't feel like it was an affair because, it's just my friend.
Right.
I did talk about things, but they were telling me things. They were telling me about things going on with them. And so a little bit more, I want to go over a few more things that kind of help clarify this.
Okay.
It's an emotional affair if you're keeping the details of this relationship secret from your spouse. That's one way to know it's an emotional affair. So you're keeping the details of this relationship secret from your spouse. You're saying and doing things with the other person that you wouldn't do with your spouse present. So you're saying or doing things with this other person that you wouldn't do with your spouse present.
If your spouse wasn't there, you probably would change your tune.
Maybe you wouldn't even go to that area. You're sharing things with the other person that you wouldn't share with your spouse, and you're making an effort to arrange to spend time with the other person. And this is important too. People who get involved in an emotional affair typically weren't looking for an affair. They didn't intend to have an affair. and they didn't think they were vulnerable to having an affair. And so that's really important.
Yeah, and the truth is we're all vulnerable. We have to always keep our antenna up, our antennas up.
And about half of emotional affairs do develop into a physical relationship.
Interesting.
So, and about 79% of people weren't seeking an affair. We're not seeking an affair. And that's information from DearPeggy.com. He was an affair recovery expert as well. And so many times people just think it's harmless. But the fact is that these things do turn sexual. And many times the distance between no physical contact and kissing is a longer distance between kissing and physical intimacy.
Will you say that one more time?
Yeah. The distance between no physical contact and kissing is a much longer distance than when people start kissing and the physical intimacy that develops.
It's much easier to go from kissing to physical.
Yeah, it's just a natural progression of things.
Yeah.
And so, that's an emotional affair. The next type of affair, and this is the other type of limerent affair, strongly limerent, idealized love affair. This is a love addiction that's characterized by a repetitive pattern of moving from one relationship to the next, falling into a love that doesn't exist. Although this pattern has an addictive quality to it, these are not necessarily sexual relationships. They also do not fall under the category of people who have become emotionally involved in an inappropriate friendship. There is a compulsive pattern to their behavior. It is about the feeling of falling in love with that one right person. So this type of affair is about the feeling of falling in love with that one right person.
The butterflies that you get, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And of course, they can't find that one right person. So this never-ending search for the one right person prevents full commitment to a marriage, and having discovered that their mate isn't the right person, Mr. or Mrs. Right, these people will compulsively pursue the search for their soulmate. And we've had this in our office where people will come in and want to leave their spouse because they think they found their soulmate. They think they found it. And they've met their spouse through an affair as well. And so it's kind of this progression like this. And it's really, they're looking for that falling in love, that perfect fairy tale type relationship.
Yeah, that's not accurate
exist.
Or realistic.
Yeah, and they're looking for the right person instead of trying to be the right person. And so falling in love is not, this quote-unquote falling in love thing that they're looking for is not love at all. When this occurs, it is not even about the other person. It is how it makes them feel about themselves. Anyone who has fallen in love will eventually fall out of love and then must choose to love, because love grows in stages. You have the romantic love, then you experience disillusionment, and then you have mature love where you choose to love. So anybody in every relationship moves past romantic love. That's nature's way of helping us bond with each other, develop a relationship with each other, but it moves on to disillusionment. You begin to see flaws and weaknesses, and then you have to choose to love. And these people keep thinking, well, crap, I want this romantic love feeling. I like this being in love feeling. And they keep looking for that. And when it ends with one relationship, they go to the next for it. And so pretty much anyone who has fallen in love is going to fall out of love. And you have to choose to love. What real love is. True love is based on knowing the other person and letting that person know you. This is a healthy intimacy, and not this false intimacy the love addict has mistaken for love. They've clung to and obsessively pursued, and that's that part of limerence. So characteristics of this, it occurs in male and females, but it can happen more often with females. The betrayer will be ambivalent about their marriage. They also tend to overvalue the person they're infatuated with. They may think this person is the greatest thing ever. They are incapable of judging the negative characteristics of the affair partner. While they may see the defects, they won't give these defects any weight. Rather, they see them as unique or special. So even the negative flaws of this person they look at as unique or special.
And is that before they actually join in a relationship with that person and then see more clearly, or is it just like an infatuation that wears off over time? Is that
it could be usually it wears off over time.
Okay, but then they start to see those flaws maybe differently at that time when the infatuation wears off.
Well, yeah, they'll notice them as flaws then. But when they're when they're involved in limerence and this in love feeling, they don't even really consider, many times they don't even consider the weaknesses. And when they do, they might look at it as, oh, he only has a temper because he's just passionate about stuff.
He's a passionate
he gets
guy.
so passionate he punches holes in the wall.
Yeah.
Gosh, I love somebody who's so passionate about life. That's how they'll look at it.
Yeah.
It could be something that silly. So it occurs more often with females. They tend to be ambivalent about their marriage. I love my spouse, but I'm not in love with my spouse. We'll hear that. That's a sign of this kind of affair, or even any affair really. But they tend to be ambivalent. they've experienced this kind of relationship with someone else and they want to try to recreate that with their spouse, and they may decide to leave them. They don't feel that emotional bond that's there. They also tend to overvalue the person they're infatuated with. We were talking about that a moment ago. They're really incapable of judging the negative characteristics of the affair partner, and that's because of limerence, and we talked about that before in a previous show. Limerence is also known as love sickness, love addiction, infatuation, obsessive love, romantic love, and it really just clouds your judgment on how you see things.
Yeah.
These defects, may be seen, they don't really consider it. They may see them as unique or special.
Yeah.
Kind of what I was talking about with the anger.
Sure.
This may not be an actual relationship with the person they're infatuated with. It could be like an obsession that's not reciprocated.
Interesting.
So it could be somebody they work with.
It's like a challenge.
It could be like a challenge, but that's also how limerence works. It's when eye contact's made. It's when you find someone that you think is attractive or you think that's interested in you, and there's eye contact with them. Many times that's kind of when limerence starts. And we've talked about that progression.
That's the fall, like you talked about, yeah.
And so they may not even have a relationship with this person. And these betrayers will often frequently complain about the lack of romantic love in their relationship. They feel like they've married the wrong person.
The marital relationship,
Yeah. They'll complain about the lack of love in their marital relationship. And they'll complain about, gosh, I think I married the wrong person here. And they'll experience obsessive thoughts about the romantic partner, this limerent object. And that's really what happens is this person becomes objectified, that they feel like they're in love with. They wouldn't say that, but that's typically how psychologists describe this experience. This person becomes an object. And so, they experience obsessive thoughts about this new romantic partner. They spend as much as 80% of their time awake thinking about this person, trying to determine how this other person feels about them. And the obsessive nature of this relationship creates unrealistic expectations of the love object. So this kind of relationship, they're so obsessed with it that they create unrealistic expectations of this person that they're in love with. Like this person's got to be God or walk on water, or they have these really unhealthy, unrealistic views of who this person is.
Yeah, and you had mentioned just a couple of seconds ago about most of the time, they feel like, well, maybe they married the wrong person, but it seems like a lot of these affairs, they might say that, well, I just don't know if I married the right person. But I could imagine once you dig in and find out, well, why they had the affair, what the reasons are, how they view their relationship and love and that other person. That's when you can determine that it's this. Really, we shouldn't be pathologizing our spouse or trying to, just based on one radio show, trying to figure out.
Because these affairs, honestly, every affair has a lot of these characteristics. The duality between the spouse and the affair partner, the feeling of love, feeling like you've made a mistake. There's a lot of commonality in a lot of these different types of affairs. But what we've done is we've really classified these to make it easier to understand what's happening in those affairs. One of the key things to understanding why is really asking that question. We've been over this before, but it's worth repeating. How are you different in this affair? That's so important because a lot of this, as you can see from each one of these affairs, it goes from someone to talk to, someone to have shared interest in, and then someone who I think is this right person.
Yeah, the soulmate.
It goes from these different experiences, and each person going through an affair has different motivations. And so just to classify one, it's always this way. It's not always that way. Right. There may be similarities, but these categories are helpful in just understanding where your spouse is at. And if you've had an affair, you may fit in more than one category. You may fit in 2 categories or 3 categories. In recovering from an affair, it's important to disclose all secrets. And that's very hard for people to do because the person who had the affair has so much shame and embarrassment. They feel like talking about the affair only makes it worse for their spouse. But healing from an affair, it's important to be honest, transparent, and show your spouse that you're willing to do whatever it takes.
Yes.
And if it's difficult to talk about the affair, you need to talk about your fear with your spouse on why this is so difficult for you.
Yeah.
Because your spouse thinks that you don't care about them or they think you're still involved in the affair.
Right.
But if you talk about how this is difficult for you to talk about this, how you're afraid of making them hurt, how you're ashamed, don't want to relive this,
right,
how you want to put this behind you because the guilt is so strong, that will help your spouse begin to heal as well.
Right.
But your spouse is going to keep asking for answers and want to talk about it, talk about your fear. Talk about how hard this is for you to talk about it.
Yeah.
That's okay, too.
It's a great place to go and start.
It's a great place to start.
And, we've said in the past, the first 90 days are the hardest. It's, would you say, 2 years to rebuild the trust?
Yeah, typically. It depends on how well couples manage that negative cycle that they get into. And that's what we try to help couples really with. And you don't see that too much in affair recovery, especially some of the books or information online.
You don't see what too much?
You don't see people really address the negative cycle, in my opinion.
Right.
They give you instructions on how to talk about it, but they don't talk about the motivations behind each person, what they're needing. And so getting professional help dealing with the negative cycle, because ultimately honesty is important for building trust, but ultimately what helps you heal besides the honesty is the emotional connection with your spouse. And you've got to get out of the negative cycle, because the negative cycle you're trying to heal with, many times is the negative cycle you had before the affair.
And the negative cycle is that pattern of
pattern of interacting.
Yeah.
Attacking each other, avoiding each other. So you got to deal with that.
Right. Do you want to recap what we talked about, and then we'll go on to the last few?
Yeah, there are 10 different types of affairs. I've identified some of these. Rick Reynolds from Austin, Texas has identified some of these as well. 10 different types of affairs. There is the one-night stand. This occurs generally when someone has had too much to drink and being anonymous is involved. They want to stay in the marriage. It's not an ongoing relationship. At times it can morph into an ongoing relationship, though. And let me pause and say this, Morgan. We're categorizing these affairs for the purpose of understanding them. Our listeners who have gone through an affair, their affair may contain more than one category. Kind of like I was saying a moment ago about the one-night stand, that can lead into a relationship. I've seen that in my office. It begins that way, but then a relationship starts, so it becomes an emotional affair. Your affair, your experience may not fit nicely into only one category. It can be divided into 2 or 3 categories, and so this is just to help us understand things better. There's the one-night stand. We talked about that, and then there's the limerent affair. And limerent affairs, this is more the classic limerent affair. There's another limerent affair that we talked about last week, but in this classic limerent affair, this is when 2 people feel like they're in love and they feel powerless over these emotions of love. And limerence is that feeling, and we've spent time talking about this too.
Yeah.
It's that feeling of infatuation, love sickness, romantic love, obsessive love. When you're not around that person, you feel despair. You wonder, do they feel that way about me? So there's despair there. So they want to be with their affair partner. And then what can happen as well is there is feelings of guilt because you see what you're doing to your family, what you're doing to your spouse. And in fact, we had someone in our office this past week, very first session, who came in with this. And this is kind of that classic limerent affair. And so you see this, it can kind of grow in stages. So you don't always see it at this level of maturity this guy's been at. And let me say this, he was already in that place of ambiguity after 1 month of experiencing this. So that limerent feeling develops quickly.
Yeah.
And it causes doubt.
Sometimes by locking eyes, that someone could fall into this love sickness, this infatuation.
Yeah, and they think, they either find that person attractive and they lock eyes with them, and then the other part of that is they feel like that person could be interested in them. And so those are things that are at play.
And it's the love object that we've talked about too.
Yeah, they're a love object.
The object that satisfies their imagination.
And so when someone experiences a limerent affair, they believe that they want out of the marriage. Sometimes it's a friendship that's developed into a romance. The betrayer is willing to sacrifice life as they know it to have the opportunity to be with that affair partner. This dance of insanity of going back and forth between the marriage and the affair partner.
Yeah.
The guilt and the shame about leaving, and then the ecstasy when they're with the affair partner, that can continue for a long time. And so then the next type of affair that we discovered was a sex addict's affair. We discussed characteristics of sex addiction, what happens with that.
And there's a very small percentage of affairs, right, that are actually, because we think that sex addiction is every affair when we look at it on TV or something like that. It's people assume it must be just like 99% of the affairs are. And
I'm not a sex addiction expert, but I would say very little has been sex addiction or very extreme cases of sex addiction in our practice. We've seen at least 200 couples probably with an affair. I can easily think of 3 that had an extreme case of sex addiction. And then there's people involved in pornography, and that's not necessarily sex addiction, but I can think of 3, maybe 4 out of 200. So it's not as common as the media portrays it, but it's something that's very real. Then we talked about the shared interest affair. This is when the betrayer is involved with a single person, but at the same time they don't want to leave the marriage. And then to the person having an affair, they view this person as a soulmate, and the betrayer wants to stay married, And their life is divided into two parts. The part shared with their spouse and the part that's shared with the affair partner. And they feel like two different sets of needs are met in those two different relationships. Sometimes these affairs frequently spring from a relationship where these two individuals share something in common, such as music, art, or another interest. It could be anything. Computers. And they're just techies, and they like discussing that kind of thing.
They connect on that level.
Yeah, they connect on that level. And so it's something that they don't share in common with their spouse, so they turn to the affair partner for understanding, companionship, and support. Then we talked about the emotional affair. And most affairs obviously have an element of what an emotional affair is. We talked about that. Boundary issues are a factor. How the betrayer can be better friends with this person than with their spouse. How the betrayer can keep secrets with this person instead of with their spouse. How the betrayer doesn't want to have to choose between their friend and their spouse. And ultimately, the betrayer does want to stay married.
Thumb for that one is if the person that you're striking up a friendship with knows more about your relationship and what's going on than your spouse does, then you're heading down that path.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Then this is the other limerent affair that we talked about. I call this the I want to be in love affair. There's two different types. The one that we described earlier with the guilt and the ambiguity about staying and going, where the guy after a month had already just being limerent with someone, was already kind of wanting out of the marriage. And then this is the other limerent affair, the I want to be in love affair. And this is kind of a love addiction that's characterized by repetitive pattern of moving from one relationship to the next, falling into a love that doesn't last. Right. Kind of keep looking for the perfect person, the perfect love experience is really what they're looking for.
It's an idealized idea, just an idealized version of a human being.
Yep. And it occurs with men and women. I've seen it happen with both. They're all about falling in love more than anything else. And they've got to find that one right person. That's a search that never ends. They've bought into a lie. It's almost like a fairy tale they've bought into.
Someday my prince or princess will come.
Yeah.
We've talked about that.
Yeah. And then the philanderer's affair. And the philanderer is someone who basically believes that cheating is justifiable. It's morally okay in some way. As long as it's not intercourse, it's okay. Honestly, you'll see this a lot. People who go to a lot of these conventions for work or trade shows, things like that, a lot of these conventions, there's a lot of people, quote unquote, hooking up at those kinds of things because it's like a one night stand. They're anonymous, maybe not any alcohol involved, but they'll have these different things. And in a way, it's kind of like this, hey, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's this, kind of philanderer attitude. They may have, and they can be influenced by a parent who is a cheater.
It's kind of a rite of passage.
Yeah. I remember my dad telling me his dad was a cheater. And my dad telling me one time that having an affair was a rite of passage. And I remember thinking, Dad, that's the dumbest thing anybody's ever told me, that you've ever told me either, And he's older and he's from a different part of the country. That's just part of his generation or his mindset at the time. And the people that are most at harm with this are people who, I think it's morally just people who have lack of integrity, the moral factor, people who, they think it's okay for me to do it, but if you were to do that, me as a man, it's okay. But for you as a woman to do that, that's not acceptable. Right. And so there's a double standard there, obviously. And then some cultures have an unsaid expectation that men will have women on the side. And some women are okay with that. And so that's a kind of philanderer affair. And we talked about that a little bit more in detail last time. Then I want to get into the sexual abuse affair.
So basically, this is the 8th type of affair that we've identified. And this affair occurs when somebody has been raped or forced into sex by another individual. But the spouse of that person doesn't believe that he or she has been taken advantage of. So it's quite tricky. Maybe sometimes that person has experienced an emotional affair. Maybe they've had an emotional affair.
Yeah. Morgan, let me give some examples of this while we're talking about this so people can understand. Well, I had a situation one time where a woman was having an emotional affair with a guy, and when it turned sexual, she resisted it. She didn't want to go sexual, and the guy raped her, basically. He raped her against her will. So the husband
didn't believe her.
Yeah, I had a very hard time believing that.
Yeah.
That it's something like that happening. He's dealing with his own pain, doesn't trust her because he's been deceived enough. He's like, well, this is a pretty creative deception. So he had a hard time believing that. And then another time, there's a third time. I've seen this a few times. Another time this happened is where, and that's actually happened a couple times where women have gotten raped and their husbands.
It's very hard for them to believe.
Yeah, it's very hard to believe it because of the boundaries they were crossing.
And the trust that was violated originally.
Yeah. And I know this probably is a little controversial. I was talking about this. It's very hurtful for the person who's been involved. there's shame from being abused like that, and then turning for support and not getting it. So there's both people are suffering.
Yeah.
And getting help with this type of affair, I would say, is very vital. Someone who's got experience in working with affairs and with couples, it's very, very, very important because, it's just vital. Another time where I've seen this is a guy that knew a female that he worked with. She was sending him pictures. He didn't tell his wife anything about it. He didn't say stop it or anything. He kind of felt flattered getting these kind of lewd pictures. One day she comes on to him sexually, and in the middle of it, after about a minute into it, he says, I can't do this. I just can't do this. This isn't right.
And tries to back away.
Yeah, tries to back away from it. And then she accuses him of raping her. This is a very, very, very dangerous thing. And it's obviously hard for both people involved. It's obviously hard for the one who's in the middle of it, who experienced this. I usually say the injured spouse, the one who's been betrayed, both are kind of injured in the situation, but the one who wasn't involved, the one who feels like they've been cheated on, it's really hard for them. And consequently, that makes it much harder for the one who was involved in that kind of thing.
So kind of the moral of the story is if someone is sending you text messages, or always be above board and talk to your spouse about everything. Being open and honest is so crucial because things like this happen.
Well, and part of what makes it hard is that person was still involved in some gray.
Yeah.
And that makes it hard for the one who's been betrayed, to really go along with the story and believe everything.
Right.
Because they're like, whatever, come on.
You were already doing something.
Yeah. And then another time, a woman who was just drugged, and her, and she was taken advantage of. And so those, there's things like this that happen. There are people out there that do this kind of thing, unfortunately.
And they prey on people too.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
They're looking for you to let your guard down and
it's men and women that do this. It's women as well. It's not just men.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That prey.
Well, there's some characteristics here.
Yeah, go ahead.
A few of these are sexual contact was attempted or forced on the spouse, kind of like in your examples. The spouse may have started to be a willing participant at first, but changed their mind at some time during sexual activity. Sometimes, usually the beginning, I would say. Well, but then again, could be in the middle.
Yeah. And let me say this, Morgan. The spouse, they might have been a willing participant at first, and then changed their mind, or they could have been not involved and forced. They could have been passive, not involved at all.
Right.
And because this is rare, the spouse who wasn't involved, the spouse who feels like they've been betrayed, they typically don't believe their spouse was raped or taken advantage of, which only leads to more shame for the injured spouse, for the involved spouse.
Absolutely, because just imagine not being, believed when you've been hurt.
Oh, it's horrible.
It's horrible, yeah.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's ridiculous pain.
So both people need healing big time. And this happens, like you said, with both men and women. And Brad, you want to go on to the revenge affair? Yeah,
the revenge affair. This is an affair that occurs after a spouse has been betrayed. They feel like they're not healing fast enough, or they feel like the betrayer isn't helping them heal.
Or they're not getting it.
They're not being honest. Right. They're continuing the deception. They're still involved in their own affair.
Yeah.
And in a way, they're kind of throwing up their hands saying, you know what?
If you're going to do that to me,
I'm going to do it to you. And so they want to make the spouse who's having the affair understand the pain that they're in.
And to wake them up. Sometimes.
And to wake them up, yeah. And typically this occurs after several months of trying. And I've seen this. Typically, it's kind of almost like a last-ditch effort where they're trying to get a response out of their spouse on a matter to them. And so typically, several months after trying to recover from the affair, they feel like they're not getting answers as to why it occurred, or they're not getting that person there to help them. And they're like, you know what?
I'm lonely. I'm tired.
Yeah. I'm going to do this on my own. I'm tired of hurting.
Yeah.
And so they have kind of a revenge affair. And I've seen this happen a few times where people just get so exhausted, so burned out, and they feel like they're the only one trying to make it work, that they're like, I'm going to show you what it feels like.
Yeah.
And then they go do it. That can be difficult. If you don't have a therapist who's trained in infidelity, that can be difficult.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I saw that, the first 2 times I saw that was pretty difficult, because you got someone who's burned out having their own affair. Then you've got someone who's been caught in an affair for some time, not helping their spouse heal. And then all of a sudden they feel betrayed and they're like, hey, you just hurt me. How come?
But they have no ground to stand on because they also have done it.
Well, but that's what the spouse who just had the revenge affair thinks. But now that person's been hurting as well.
Yeah.
Because you abandoned me. You're not there for me anymore.
Right.
And it gets complicated because both people are hurting, both feel abandoned.
Right.
The spouse who just had the revenge affair is saying, look, you've been abandoning me all this time.
Yeah.
And now you're not helping me.
It's kind of like that whole adage of two wrongs don't make a right.
Yeah.
Because pain begets pain and more pain.
Yeah. It doesn't make it right.
Right. It doesn't help.
Yeah. And that's a tricky type of affair because when people get into that, both are hurting, both want answers. And, what's really hard about this is both of them are thinking of their own pain at the moment. And it's pretty deep. So both people are caught in their own pain, and it's pretty hurtful.
It's really hard to step back and help your spouse when you feel so abandoned and hurt. Do you want to go to the next one, or do you want to say anything more about I can talk about the next one?
Yeah, go ahead and talk about the exit affair.
Okay, so the exit affair is an affair that occurs because the spouse doesn't care about the future of the marriage. So they're trying to do what they can to get out. They've reached a place where they simply don't care and really about being with their spouse. They get into an affair either as a way to end the relationship with their spouse, or they're very susceptible to an affair because they're really investing so little time into the marriage. And when working with this type of affair, the betrayer may experience the feelings of ambiguity that we discussed earlier in the show, but what can be helpful in rebuilding the romantic love and influencing the betrayer to stay in the marriage is finding ways to do new, different, and exciting activities together. But really, another thing we've said in the show, too, it's important not to try to go and do a romantic candlelight dinner because that person is really thinking...
something light, new,
they're
different.
Thinking, gosh, I'm not in love with you. Why are we doing this? So one person you've talked about before, they've got tickets to the basketball game and they went and did that together because it's something that they knew that their spouse would really love and it would kind of wake them up.
Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily have to be things expensive, just new and different. It releases adrenaline in the brain. That helps. The other thing that helps, though, is honestly getting help. There's very little hope for this person when they're leaving. That's why they cheat. That's why they do this. It's almost kind of this rubber stamp, I'm done. This is me sticking the landing, so to speak.
And they're often very tired and withdrawn.
So getting professional help, that helps. Doing those exciting activities together helps. Also, the other thing is you have to deal with the negative cycles that come up, because the negative cycle is what has led the person who's having an exit affair to be burned out, to be vulnerable enough to have an affair. And let me say this, I would say most affairs that I've seen have had elements of an exit affair.
Because they're tired, they're ready to leave, they're done. Yeah,
most affairs that I've seen have had elements of an exit affair. And let me just kind of describe briefly the psychology of a betrayer. Not every betrayer fits this category, and we'll spend more time talking about this on a future show. But briefly, the psychology of a betrayer, you get caught into a negative cycle. This person, because they're in a negative cycle, they then become resentful. They begin to not share things as much. They begin not to express their feelings and emotions and share things as much. And so that negative cycle creates that kind of climate for that. So this person, because there's a negative cycle there, it goes on long enough, they get to a place where they're not really talking as much. They're kind of more withdrawn. So they're not sharing as much. They're not opening up as much. They're not confiding as much. That right there makes them vulnerable for an affair, obviously. And then they start feeling resentful. They got hurts that are there. They feel resentful. They feel alone. They feel sad. And then they start kind of feeling numb, maybe a little indifferent. And then they start, and this is the key thing, they start caring less about the marriage. And because they're caring less, they're extremely vulnerable to an affair, to someone new, to someone that's there.
That they can open up to.
That they can open up to, share, because they're human. They have to talk about something,
Yeah.
And that's why all these different things that we've seen, they really tie in well, I think, to the exit affair. Not everybody that has it, is really wanting to leave the marriage, but many times you'll see that where they're just kind of burned out. And that might be a better way to describe this is as the burned out affair instead of the exit affair. But what they do is they care less about the marriage. They're vulnerable to someone else, vulnerable to an affair, and then they experience it. They experience that romantic love. They experience
that connection
again. And
the attention from another person.
Yeah, and they feel good.
Yeah.
Because they've been miserable and unhappy.
And they can feel like they can open up to that person in a way they couldn't with their spouse.
Yeah, and and here's the tricky thing too. you'll have someone who before would never have an affair, but they get worn out so much that they're vulnerable to it, and they're already thinking of, and they'll justify it in their mind. Well, we're not happy. We're going to divorce. I want a divorce. I want to leave.
Yeah, we're splitting up anyways.
Yeah, we're splitting up anyways. And so then that's the way they justify it. But that's kind of a common thing that you see with a lot of affairs in the psychology of the betrayer. And so you could call the exit affair probably the burned out affair.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if you'd like to read a little bit more about these affairs and just more information in general, you can check out our website.
Yeah, go to our website. Yeah. We have these on there.
MarriageSolutionsTulsa.com.
Yeah, go to the blog on our website. Check that out. You'll get a lot of this good, helpful information.
And you can give us a call as well and can set an appointment with one of our therapists, 918-281-6060.
Yep. Our practice, Marriage Solutions here in Tulsa, we have one of the only group practices just dedicated to marriage counseling. This is a think tank. This is an organization where we collaborate with each other. And everybody here has advanced training. We collaborate with each other.
We research and have created some of the best methods for working with couples.
And we're a place that's just marriages only. And you want to go to a place like that because getting good help with a marriage is extremely difficult.
Right. And we help couples and individuals with relationship issues. For example, if your spouse is leaving you and you'd like to stop your divorce, we can help you with that. We've helped people where they've already divorced each other and they've had second thoughts. We've helped them to remarry each other through couples counseling. And so there are a lot of different issues within the relationship that we can help you with. But yes, couples, premarital, already married couples experiencing difficulty and trauma, as well as if you just want a refresher on your relationship.
Yeah, the couples that we've helped who've been divorced, they feel like their marriage has been restored.
Yeah.
Not just, okay, they got back together, that kind of thing, but they feel like their marriage has been restored. Yeah. And that's what's amazing.
That's the most important part.
Thanks for listening to Healing Broken Trust. If you like this episode, you can always get our show notes and more details and links to the resources we discussed at healingbrokentrust.com. Also, as long as you're online, head on over to healingbrokentrust.com/retreat for details on an upcoming one-on-one retreat with me. If you like us, please subscribe and leave a review for us on iTunes. As always, everything discussed on this podcast is either my opinion or Morgan's opinion and is not to be taken as relationship advice because I'm not your therapist, nor have I considered your personal situation as your therapist. This podcast is for your entertainment and education only, and I really do hope you've enjoyed it. See you until next time.